It was 2 o'clock in the morning when Dr. Ann Ross woke to the cold. Not an ordinary cold, the kind that settles into a bedroom on a bad night in winter, but a sudden, complete chill, as though every window in the house had been thrown open at once. Her husband, the archaeologist Richard Hexham, slept undisturbed beside her. Ross lay still, trying to place what had woken her, certain only that something in the room was wrong. Then she saw it. By the wardrobe, half lit by the hall light spilling through the open bedroom door, something was standing. It was tall, 6 feet or more, with a slight stoop to its shoulders. Its legs, so far as she could tell, looked human. Above the waist, it was something else entirely. Dark, thick-furred, the head unmistakably lupin. It was as if a wolf's skull was grafted onto a man's body, and this menacing creature was watching her from the doorway. She first assumed in the first confused seconds that she was dreaming, but things in dreams don't usually notice when they've been seen. But this thing did, as if it sensed her gaze. It turned and scurried out of the room, and Ross, inexplicably, against every instinct of self-preservation, got out of bed and followed it. She never fully explained why. Something about the way it moved suggested it wanted her to. She trailed it along the landing and down the stairs, catching a second, clear look at the shape shuffling ahead of her in the dark. And it was that second look that broke whatever spell she had been under. Fear arrived all at once. In a surge of adrenaline, she ran back upstairs and shook her husband awake. Hexham, understandably groggy and skeptical, nonetheless took the report of an intruder seriously enough to search the house top to bottom with her. Their children were asleep upstairs, and they ultimately found nothing. No broken window, no open door, no sign that anything, animal or human, had passed through the house at all. Ross would spend the rest of her life describing that experience to interviewers, and the description of the events she experienced never changed. It would have been easy and reasonable to write the whole thing off as a nightmare, except that 2 days earlier, a small package had arrived at the family's home in Southampton. Inside were 2 stone heads, and Ann Ross, a serious and respected scholar of Celtic Britain, not remotely the sort of person given to telling ghost stories, was neither the first person those heads, or anything they had conjured, had visited in the night, nor would she be the last. This is the story of how they got there, the lives they affected, and much, much more. Welcome to Mystery Archives. If you're a fan of terrifying, paranormal, unexplained, and overall mysterious stories told in an atmospheric documentary style, you, my friend, are in the right place. I have hundreds of episodes just like this one that you might want to check out. Please like, share, and subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below as we go. And now, let us begin. Hexham is an old market town in Northumberland, in England's far north. The kind of place with a handsome abbey and a quiet high street. Nothing in its recent history to suggest that anything strange might happen there. In the early 1970s, it certainly didn't look like a town about to become a byword for the uncanny. The story, as best as it can be reconstructed from the conflicting and increasingly hazy accounts of everyone involved, begins with an 11-year-old boy named Colin Robson, sitting in a classroom, modeling a small head out of plaster of Paris for a school art competition. Nobody, including Colin, could ever really explain why he chose a head as his subject. Ironic, given the topic of the story. His headmaster thought it was ugly, and other people found it faintly disturbing. Despite this, though, somehow, it won second prize anyway. Roughly several months later, either late 1971 or early 1972, Colin and his younger brother Leslie were home alone after school, waiting for their parents to get back from work. and doing what bored children have always done with an empty garden and no supervision. They began digging holes. What began as tidying up the flower beds turned, as these things do, into a straightforward excavation. As their tools toiled the soil, roughly about 2 feet down, Colin's spade struck something solid. Stopping, he set the spade aside and worked the object free of the soil. What he revealed was a rounded stone object about the size of a tangerine, a crude, carved face staring back at him. Showing it to his brother, who was also intrigued, the two dug 6 inches further down and would find a second one. The two heads were clearly a pair, but not identical. One was gaunt and angular, with a stylized, almost Celtic-looking hairstyle and a distinctly masculine cast to its features. The other was rounder and softer, more expressive and feminine. This head would later earn a less than flattering nickname of the Hag. Both had a heaviness to them that made the boys think that they had found something genuinely old. Excited and a little frightened by their own discovery, Colin and Leslie ran next door to their neighbor, Nellie Dodd, who lived with her husband Isaac and their 6 children. She had no better idea than they did what the heads were, but she suggested the sensible thing: take them to Hexham Abbey and ask. Upon doing just that, a priest there agreed to look into it and promised to return the heads within a few days. For a short while, that was the whole story. 2 schoolboys, an interesting find, the stuff of a good show and tell, and nothing much more. But things didn't stay that way. In the nights that followed, the Dodd children, who shared a room next door to the Robsons' garden, began complaining of a strange, persistent sound, a soft pattering, like that of small feet, crossing the floor after dark. Nellie told them that it was probably soot falling in the chimney and thought little more of it, assuming that it was her children's overactive imaginations. But then came the night that everything changed. As darkness prevailed over the light this day, 7-year-old Mary was unwell with an ear infection, and as the poor child suffered, it had taken Nellie a long time to comfort and settle her. Almost as soon as she did, her son Trevor called out that someone, or something, was touching his leg. He shared a room with his younger brother Brian, and Nellie, assuming the boys were simply messing about in the dark, told them to go back to sleep. Later, Brian would insist that it hadn't been a joke, that he too had felt something, a hand moving through his hair. On her way back to check on Mary, Nellie noticed that something wasn't right. The landing window was standing open, its curtains flapping in the wind. She was sure that she had shut it previously. Growing uneasy, she climbed into bed beside her daughter, intending to stay with her through the night, and she would soon fall asleep. However, in the early morning hours, Mary woke, and what she saw terrified her. Upon seeing it, she would shake her mother awake too. There, standing in the room, was a large and menacing figure. It appeared to be part man, part animal, an abhorrent chimera of sorts. Nellie would later say that the creature had the lower body of a person, but the head of a sheep or ram, that it had hooves rather than human feet. For a moment, she told herself that it had to be a dream. Then the thing reached out and touched her leg. The horrifying sensation of claws against her skin snapped her fully and violently awake. Her scream would wake the entire house, as well as the Robsons next door, and understandably so. Isaac Dodd came running to find his wife in hysterics. But bizarrely, a search of the house turned up nothing. There was no creature, no intruder, but unnervingly the front door was wide open, as though whatever had been in the room had simply left through it. The Robson boys, hearing the commotion, hurried over and found Nellie and her youngest daughter shaking with fear, and the whole family wondering just what had happened. Colin Robson would remember the look on their faces for the rest of his life. A few days later, the heads came back from the abbey. The priest, despite his efforts, had learned nothing useful about their origin. But upon their return to the Robson house, strange activity began almost immediately. It started small, which seems to be the pattern with things of this nature, as we've come to see, covering so many stories over the years here. The heads, which were being kept on a shelf in the living room, each morning would be found turned to face the garden. They would be facing the exact spot where they had been unearthed, despite no one having touched them. The family, as a result of this strangeness, began deliberately repositioning them before bed as a kind of experiment, and each and every morning they found them turned again. Colin's father, convinced one of the children was sleepwalking or playing a trick on everybody, eventually stalked out the room for multiple nights and never once caught anyone in the act. Yet the heads would be moved, despite the surveillance. Then the disturbances escalated. Pictures dropped off walls. A bathroom mirror turned up balanced on top of a frying pan on the kitchen counter, undamaged, as though someone had placed it there with expert care and precision. According to the family, ornaments and other decorations didn't just fall, they were thrown and shattered against walls, even those furthest away from where they were. There was a persistent, unshakable sense in the house that they were no longer entirely alone. It was as if they were being constantly watched. The garden too seemed to have its own oddities. Where the heads had been buried, in due time, a large flower sprang up, and it appeared from inside the house to be illuminated by some unexplained source. Anyone who stepped outside to look found nothing but ordinary daylight or darkness, depending on the time of day. And at night, more than once, the family heard what could be only described as a baby crying, and these screams were drifting up from the empty garden hole where the heads had been uncovered. It was around this time that the press got interested, drawn first by the novelty of the discovery, and then, far more eagerly, by the paranormal stories and the creepy account of a half-man, half-goat creature seen next door. Reporters descended on Hexham for what was, from a news perspective, a godsend of a story. At some point in this chaotic stretch, a local television presenter with a sideline as a clergyman came to the Robsons' door, a man named Reverend Peter Moth, and having heard that the Celtic historical scholar Dr. Ann Ross was due to give a lecture in the area, and thinking she needed to see the heads for herself, offered to take the heads to her. And according to Colin Robson, his mother Jenny didn't hesitate. "Take them," she said, "and don't bring them back." The family, it seemed, had had enough, and that, by Colin's account, was the last time he ever saw the original heads with his own eyes. The heads themselves as symbols hold significance, and to understand how and why scholars would get involved, it's important to understand. The ancient Celts, who once occupied much of Britain and Europe before the Roman conquests, had what historians and archaeologists now describe as a cult of the head. This wasn't in a purely gruesome sense, although the practice had its darker sides. The head, in Celtic belief, was understood to be the seat of the soul, the most sacred and powerful part of the human body, the part that contained whatever made a person who they were. This belief often showed up in their art, their ritual practices, and their archaeology in ways that have been well documented by modern researchers. Stoneheads in particular appear throughout Celtic territory, in northern England, in Ireland, in Scotland, and in parts of what is now France. They were carved and placed at entrances to settlements, near sacred water sources, at boundaries between one kind of space and another. Some researchers believe that they were votive objects, meant to invoke protection or some kind of spiritual power. Others see them as markers, a way of claiming or consecrating a particular piece of ground. What they weren't, in the overwhelming majority of cases, was decorative in any casual sense. And so the heads traveled south to Southampton, into the home of a woman uniquely qualified and uniquely unprepared to receive them. Anne Ross was one of Britain's foremost authorities in Celtic religion and iconography, and her house was no stranger to strange old artifacts. She kept a substantial private collection of stone heads for comparative study, but something about the Hexham pair unsettled her from the first moment she picked them up. There was an instinctive, immediate unease she couldn't quite explain. She would lock them away in her study, intending to have them properly analyzed before eventually sending them north to Newcastle for further examination. 1 or 2 nights later came the 2 a.m. visitation described at the beginning of this story. Ross said afterward that she made no connection in that moment between the creature in her bedroom doorway and the heads sitting in her locked room below. Whether she already knew about the Dodds sighting or about the half-man, half-goat reports circulating in the Hexham papers is unknown. It's entirely possible that she came to the case as a historian with no notion of the strange stories attached to them, and yet it's equally possible those stories were already sitting somewhere in the back of her mind for one reason or another. Either way, she and Fetcham apparently told no one else in the family what had happened that night. A few days after the 2 a.m. incident, Ross and her husband arrived home to find their teenage daughter Bernice in a state of shock. She was pale as a ghost, visibly shaking, and was unable at first to explain what was wrong. She had let herself in after school hours earlier and had started up the stairs. As she ascended the steps, she looked up, and there before her was a massive black shape standing on the steps just above her. Whatever it was, it didn't appear to be human. Before she could react, it charged towards her with incredible speed, and at the last possible moment, it leapt clean over the banister and landed below, then vanished deeper into the house. Remember that this poor child was completely unaware of anything her parents had experienced previously. Just imagining how terrifying that experience must have been for her. Just, my God. Yet despite this, Bernice too said that she had felt an odd pull to chase after it, a strangely similar description to the compulsion her mother had experienced. But given the state that she was in, her legs ultimately gave out, and she sank to the floor, where she remained frozen with fear until her parents got home. The thought of these nightmarish apparitions or creatures appearing and then lurking and or vanishing deeper into the house makes my blood run cold. One would have to then try and search and ensure their safety, and just the mere idea of one of these things lurking in the shadows or around every corner is just downright scary to me, to say the least. After that, the house never quite settled. The family repeatedly heard the padded footfalls of something moving through the hallway, as if the same brief sequence kept replaying itself. Massive dark shapes flickered at the edge of their vision and were gone in the blink of an eye before they could look directly at them. Ross, when working alone in her study, had her door burst open again and again, each time only to reveal nobody on the other side. Despite these events, the doctor had the heads scientifically dated, and they came back at roughly 1800 years old, consistent with a Celtic origin. She also developed a theory to match their discovery. She believed that the Robsons' garden might have once been the site of a Celtic shrine. Since ancient Celtic religion is well documented as having venerated human heads, as previously mentioned, even and often those of defeated enemies, as sacred objects. If that were true, she reasoned, it wasn't unreasonable to think that the site itself carried something of that history with it. Eventually, though, reasoning gave way to simple self-preservation. The experiences were continuing, and Ross decided that the heads needed to be as far away from her family as possible. Thus, she shipped them off to Newcastle's Museum of Antiquities. and almost as soon as they left the house, the disturbances ceased. Just as the story seemed to be settling into a straightforward, if extraordinary, account of ancient, haunted artifacts, a lorry driver named Desmond Craigie picked up the phone to a local newspaper and in a single conversation threatened to unravel the entire thing. Craigie explained that he had once lived in the Robsons' house, that his family had rented it for around 30 years, until roughly a year before the boys' discovery, that he was the one who had made the heads, that they weren't close to 2,000 years old at all. About 16 years earlier, as a plaster and mortar toy for his younger daughter, quickly rolled it together by hand, like a pair of snowballs, with faces molded into them. His daughter, he said, had used the foil from chocolate bar wrappers to give them eyes. He had made a third head too, he claimed, though it was never recovered or uncovered like the others were. When his own daughter recognized the heads on television, Craigie found the whole affair of an alleged ancient Celtic shrine built on his old back garden craft project enormously funny. Ross, to her credit, didn't dismiss his claim out of hand. She invited Craigie to make her a replica on the spot, reasoning that if he really had made the originals as a rough afternoon's amusement, he ought to be able to reproduce something similar without much effort. If instead the object showed genuine skill and consistency with authentic Celtic carving traditions, that would tell its own story. When Craigie produced his replica, most observers who compared it to the original heads saw little real resemblance. Later research by the writer Paul Screeton, who has done more than perhaps anyone to untangle this case, turned up something else worth knowing. Craigie had something of a reputation locally as a prankster, which cuts both ways. It makes the confession easier to doubt, but it also raises the question of why he'd have stuck to the same story without ever profiting much from it for the rest of his life. There's also a puzzling photograph reproduced in Screeton's book that appears to show Craigie posing with what looks like the original heads, though no one, including Craigie's own son, has ever been able to say when or where it was taken. Perhaps Craigie really did carve some heads of his own during this time in that house, but they weren't the same objects that the Robson boys dug up years later. Perhaps something about that particular patch of dirt had a way of putting the idea of heads into people's minds. The same idle impulse that led an 11-year-old Colin Robson to sculpt an unsettling little face out of plaster of Paris shortly before he had ever put a spade in the ground. Geologists added their own confusion on top of Craigie's. Experts in Newcastle and Southampton examined the heads and reached different conclusions. One team estimated an age closer to 2,000 years, similar to the age dating from Dr. Ross. The other, reading the same material as evidence of a much more recent creation. To this day, no consensus exists on how old the Hexham heads actually were. From Anne Ross, they eventually passed into the hands of Don Robbins, a materials chemist known for popularizing what is now known as the stone tape theory, which is the idea that certain events, under the right conditions, might somehow imprint themselves onto stone or other physical material and later be released, like a recording playing back by accident. Limestone is one of the stones that is particularly attributed to this phenomenon. Robbins thought the Hexham heads were a promising test case. Perhaps what generations of witnesses had been seeing wasn't a haunting in any traditional sense, but the residue of some long-past event, replaying itself whenever the objects were disturbed. He never personally witnessed a manifestation of a figure the way Ross or Nellie Dodd had, but whatever he did experience led him coming away convinced that the heads carried something, some kind of energy that produced an atmosphere, a weight, the persistent and probably irrational sense of being watched by them, no matter where in the room. He set them down. From Robbins, the trail leads to a man named Frank Hyde, who had a serious interest in dowsing and the paranormal overall. Robbins, hoping Hyde's methods might shed some new light on the objects, handed the heads over and asked to be kept informed of any findings. Shortly afterward, Hyde was seriously injured in a terrible car accident. He survived, but from that point on, Robbins found him increasingly difficult to reach. Contact grew sparser over the following months, and then eventually stopped altogether. Hyde seemed to simply vanish, and the heads vanished with him. Robbins later described the disappearance in suitably folkloric terms. It was, he said, as though Hyde had walked into a fairy hill out of an old folk tale and never came back out. And that, as far as anyone has ever been able to establish, is where the Hexham heads remain. Somewhere, presumably in a box in an attic or a storage unit, with someone entirely unaware of the mythology that has grown around them. Or possibly, they don't exist at all anymore. Nobody truly knows. If you want answers to this mystery, unfortunately, there aren't really any, and it's worth being honest about why. Almost every detail here has at least two conflicting versions in the historical record due to the telephone effect that seems to consume most stories over time, especially those of a mythological or paranormal nature. Even the year of the original discovery is disputed. That's not on its own strong enough evidence of a deliberate hoax. It's simply what happens to a story that broke as a minor local curiosity and was covered by whatever reporters happened to be free rather than serious investigators, and then didn't become a genuinely famous case until years later, once the trail had already gone cold and the objects themselves could no longer be examined. By the time the story reached its widest audience, via a BBC current affairs segment broadcast on Nationwide in 1976, in which Anne Ross gave her account on camera alongside unsettling footage that included a clip from a Hammer horror film. Many of the people closest to the original events were recalling things they had experienced as children, stories that were filtered through years of time and family retellings. Even the central sighting, which was presented at the beginning of this episode, has no true fixed shape. Ross consistently described something wolf-like some kind of chimera or lycanthrope or werewolf-style creature or apparition, and her daughter described almost the exact same thing. And Nellie Dodd's description was equally consistent, with her saying that the figure that she saw had the head of a sheep or a ram. They both described the apparitions as animalistic. One theory offered locally traces this back to a different and more mundane source entirely. A group of men, having had a good deal to drink, allegedly stole a carcass from a nearby slaughterhouse, and one of them was seen walking home with a sheep slung over his shoulders. For Dodd's experience in particular, it's a more plausible explanation, though it doesn't obviously match Nellie's account of the figure with hooves that reached out and touched her, a figure that was within her home. And with this, there's also no solid evidence that the drunken theft ever actually took place. There are also later claims of a ghostly, half-man, half-sheep figure tied to that same slaughterhouse, though these appear to have surfaced only after the Hexham story had already become locally famous, which rather undercuts them as independent corroboration. This also doesn't account for the wolf-like creatures seen at different times and by different people, albeit they were family members, but with Ross's daughter supposedly having no prior knowledge of what her parents had seen the night before. What's left after all the caveats is a case built almost entirely on testimony, albeit sincere and even consistent in its broad strokes. It's also wildly inconsistent in its details. And now, with the story being 50 years old, the details become less and less accurate, as we've come to see. It's pretty incredible, though, lesser details aside, that a pair of small stone heads, dug from a garden by two bored children, led to a house that wouldn't settle after the heads came inside. A neighbor, and also a respected scholar, who saw or believed they saw something standing in their homes that had no business existing, a lorry driver's confession that never quite closed the case, and finally, two men, one a chemist chasing a theory, and the other a dowser with an interest in the unexplained, through whose hands the head slipped for the last time. The BBC's rediscovery of that lost 1976 broadcast, its long missing audio finally recovered decades later using voice recognition software and released to the public, has given the story a fresh audience, and with it, a fresh round of speculation. Perhaps somewhere out there in the world, the artifacts known as the Hexham heads are still sitting in a box, similar to Pandora's. Maybe they are waiting for someone curious enough or foolish enough to open it and start the whole series of events over again. So especially for my British friends, but really it could be anyone. The next time you're opening something old that you found in your attic, or something you came into possession of for one reason or another, be cautious, be wary, and don't let the cold gaze of the heads turn towards you. That's all for this episode, guys. I had this topic suggested to me for a good while in the comments, and I had vaguely heard about it, but hadn't had the chance yet until I was putting this fully together to dive into the story. And man, what a story it was. So many creepy elements and events. It was well worth the time on my end, so I hope it was worth the time for you. If you enjoyed, please hit subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment below of your thoughts or other cases that you'd like to see covered here on the channel. Hype if you have that option, and share this video or any of my videos or the channel with a friend or on social media. Basically, any and all interaction seems to send positive signals to the powers that be, which helps me out a ton. If you'd like to delve further into this story in particular, I would recommend the book Quest for the Hexham Heads by Paul Screeton. I found it to be a great resource and an intriguing read, and if you'd like to support me further and you enjoy reading, I also have 4 published books which I sell through my store, which is mysteryarchives.store. Each one contains 10 deep dives into real paranormal cases and mysteries such as this one, and various notorious occult figures. They're called Stories from the Archives, and if you purchase them through my store, I do sign and mail those myself to you. I also have merchandise you can check out there as well. If you enjoy my content and want to watch it ad-free, or just want to go the extra mile to support what I do here, you can check out my Patreon at patreon.com/mysteryarchives. I put my episodes up there first as well, and I have all episodes ad-free, as well as marathons and some older podcast episodes, updates, photos, and more there. I'll also put up a similar video to this one and a playlist to check out at the end of this video of more of my episodes. I also wanted to give a big shout out to my friend Mr. E-Files for doing a bunch of research of the events and helping me out with this video. I really appreciate it. Aside from that, guys, I appreciate you for rocking with me through the storms of life as we search for our solace where we can find it. From the bottom of my heart, thank you all for being such an awesome and supportive community and for allowing me to entertain you. Until next time, which will be soon, this has been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Make sure to stay safe out there and take care.